to our Gold participants from around the world. I'm Fiona Lang-Sharp, IBCLC Public Relations Manager and MC for Gold Learning. I'm chatting today with Miranda Buck. Welcome, Miranda. It's great to have you here.
Hi, thanks for having me, Fiona. It's lovely to speak to you again.
And Miranda will be presenting at our upcoming Gold Perinatal Online Conference, and her presentation is titled Moving Beyond Bottles, Alternative Strategies for Supplementary Feeding Newborns. Well, that is definitely a lot of information right there in the title, Miranda. I was thinking that as I was reading it earlier. What can we expect in all of this? And well, let's back up just a little bit. Before you get into what's in your presentation, why don't you go ahead and reintroduce yourself to our listening audience today, and then perhaps you can tell us a little bit about why you wanted to speak on this topic.
Hi, yeah, my name is Miranda, and I'm a neonatal nurse and a lactation consultant. I'm originally British, but now I live and work in Australia, in Melbourne, and I have just finished a PhD looking at nipple pain particularly, but my research interests are early motherhood, breastfeeding problems, and how we can better support women to reach their own breastfeeding goals. And as I work in a hospital, in a clinic, and also on the wards with the newborns. And in my work, I see a lot of babies who are not yet latching and not yet feeding at the breast. And it is always a bit of a quandary as to how we're going to feed these babies. And working with lots of different clinicians, we come across again and again the same issues of whether we should introduce bottles, whether we should cup feed, other ways of feeding at the breast with supplementary lines, for example. And with a brand new mother who is just getting the hang of the whole idea of being a mother and having this tiny baby to look after, it can often be quite overwhelming. Not just that the breastfeeding isn't working, but also that there are various different mechanisms for which we can help these babies feed. And
Sure.
using a bottle is, I think, probably the way that most parents are most familiar with feeding babies. But we know that there are a lot of disadvantages to doing that. So what I wanted to talk about was the other ways of feeding babies in the early days when breastfeeding directly at the breast isn't working, and there's different circumstances, and also to some degree how those alternative methods can then go on and be used for the duration of breastfeeding when full breastfeeding isn't possible for some women.
Well, it is such a tightrope when those new mamas are those new babies, and with those new mamas in those first few days, especially when there's a quandary of what to do next. I know I'm right there when you talk about it, Miranda. I see those mums, I hear those mums, and sometimes I feel that overwhelming feeling for them as well, because at some point some of us have experienced that, if not in person, but ourselves. Backing up there, though, you mentioned that you just got your PhD. Congratulations. That is fantastic. Well done.
Thank you. Yes, it was just yesterday I got the email, which is really exciting. I've submitted it a couple of months ago, and you have kind of this waiting period where you feel like a bit of a fraud that you've kind of finished it, but you don't really know if it's, and you kind of presume you've done all this work, it must be okay. But to have
Yeah.
the okay that it is good is wonderful.
Well, that is wonderful, and we appreciate your work here at Gold, invaluable resource to so many people around the world, and I know that you're a great advocate in the breastfeeding world. Okay, so let's get back to our topic at hand today. So we're talking about these strategies, and I know really that's what we were saying. Like sometimes these mums really are struggling, and how not to overwhelm them in the first 24, 48 hours, or first few days of life when that newborn is perhaps struggling and the mum is struggling. Must be very challenging. But you know what came to my mind too, Miranda, was the fact that a lot of it must be too the clinicians that you work with, because I know as clinicians, often we just get on one track and we don't always look at alternatives, or if something has worked in the past and we want to avoid troubling the mother or the baby or whoever it is, I can only imagine that sometimes that's also something that you come up against too. So I'd like you just to chat about that just for a minute. Could you tell me, what have been the most significant changes that you've seen with other, clinicians that work with new families, and the responses of the mothers when we're taking different tracks today?
I'm lucky that I work in a baby-friendly hospital, and so we have written policies and procedures for things like cup feeding.
Hmm.
But a lot of other hospitals, even locally here, don't have that. So when we have a lot of bank staff coming to work in the hospital, they might not be familiar with
Right.
cup feeding at all. And I think it's taking the time to teach mothers how to cup feed. I don't think it actually takes any longer than teaching a mother how to bottle feed, because bottle feeding in itself has changed how we teach it. Now we talk about paste feeding, and even the positions that we use
Right.
aren't the same as they were, not very long ago.
Hmm.
And I think particularly those ideas of paste feeding are really important for any kind of supplementary feeding. But yeah, we do have, I think particularly at night, some of our midwives might be caring for six mothers,
Wow.
which is it's a workload. And
Yeah.
I work in the public health system, so having the time to sit with each of those families and say, look, we're now going to be introducing supplementation for whatever reason, and then teaching them. I think that's one of the major challenges is the workload, the time. But I think there are still some attitudes that babies will practice sucking or get better at sucking if they have a bottle,
Right.
particularly
Yes.
in our neonatal unit.
Yeah.
They're still quite wary. And the idea that babies might choke if they're cup fed, that they might, you're just sort of pouring the milk in. I think these are all kind of common misconceptions about cup feeding.
Yeah.
And I think once you've seen it done, it's suddenly a kind of an aha moment, and particularly for the parents, I think there's something about not giving a bottle, which just
Yeah.
it's sort of a watershed. We're not crossing that line. We're not going on to bottle feeding. We're still thinking about getting breastfeeding working by using other ways. I think that's
Mhm.
something that's quite an important thing for mothers.
Sure, absolutely. And I think too, for, clinicians and new mothers, new families, I mean, bottles have been the standard for so long. It's part of our culture. And so if breastfeeding's not working, then well, you go to a bottle, don't you? I mean, and that really is a lot of what, on the outside. I mean, of course, it's wonderful that you're in a baby-friendly hospital, and I know that there's many people out there working very hard, just like you, Miranda, to make sure that you have that credential in your hospital. But I think that culturally, we still are defending that, and getting families to think differently, even when they've had a baby. Can be some of the challenges that you have, because like you said, workload is increased, it takes time, it takes a little patience. It's not the, sort of, and but even with paste bottle feeding, I love that too, because even if families today choose to have a bottle, even if we've, tried to show them alternatives or it hasn't worked, at least now we can show them that there's a different standard that, that is really good and is much healthier for our babies. So it's wonderful to hear so much of what you're doing, and I just love that you're sharing those stories today. So, last question for you. I think we could probably chat longer, but I know I don't want to keep you too long today. Actually, a holiday for Miranda today in Australia, so that's wonderful. But lastly, but not least, what are you hoping that these delegates will take away? What's the little nugget that you hope that they will take away from this presentation?
I think the key message is that breastfeeding is about more than milk,
Mm.
and that the act of breastfeeding is something that's really special and has a lot to for the mothers and babies that goes beyond just a way of feeding a baby.
Mm.
And that as soon as we move on to using bottles, we lose really quite a lot just in terms of the risks start increasing. And we do live in a culture where more and more women are expressing milk on bottle feeding. And it's probably one of the commonest questions I get in clinic is, when can I start expressing so that my partner can give a bottle? But I think
Right.
we need to talk really clearly about the fact that once you start using bottles, that how the milk is delivered, what goes into the bottle, ideas, things like prop feeding becomes much more common, much more problematic, and that other ways of keeping babies nearer the breast through using cups and supply lines um, just help us to keep mothers and babies together a little bit more and give us ways of feeding babies that babies may be more comfortable with. And we have some good evidence that help us to protect breastfeeding.
Well, wow, that's so beautiful right there. You explained and expressed that. I would be sold most definitely. But I love that. I think I'm going to steal some of that from you, Miranda. That's just wonderful. I think that it is going to take some cultural changes to happen, for our families. But when it's explained like that, and because I know families today are also wanting to improve things, and even if, like you said, it's not just about, the feeding of the milk, there's so many components that go into it. So that's wonderful. So thank you so much for explaining that so well. And as you can hear, I think that's your family in the background there on their holidays today. So we'll let you get back to them for sure. But thank you again for being and sitting down with me today.
Thank you very much for having me. I feel very strongly that we need to change our culture around these issues. So I'm hoping that this will be one small step towards more global acceptance of cup feeding.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you to our listening audience. Again, this has been Miranda Buck presenting at our Gold Perinatal Online Conference, Moving Beyond Bottles, Alternative Strategies for Supplementary Feeding Newborns. Thank you again, Miranda, and thank you to our listening audience. Bye-bye for now.